We are told they were explorers. We are told they were warriors. We are not told about the dirtier parts, the parts that don't make it into heroic poems. Nobody talks about the onion broth test, a desperate measure to see if a gut wound is fatal by checking if the smell leaks through. Nobody talks about the slave markets in Dublin, Burkas, and Hedabay, where human beings were weighed and sold like cattle. The sagas sing of glory, but graves tell a different story. They speak of violence, of dominance, and of the brutal subjugation that followed a victory feast. They speak of what happened to the women, especially the queens. After their halls fell silent and the conquerors began to pour the ale, it was a fate often more profane, more systematically cruel than you can imagine. If you value history that pulls no punches, that looks directly at the uncomfortable truths in the record, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work. And let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. This script is grounded, in fact, drawing from sources like the Annales Bertiniani, a hard-nosed 9th century Frankish court record that tracked Viking movements with cold precision, and the archaeological data from the Ridgeway Hill burial pit in Dorset, a site that tells a stark story of execution and power dynamics published in reports by Oxford Archaeology. Now, back to the story. The year is 878. The place, the fortress of Sinwit in Somerset, a Viking army led by Ubba, a son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, has been defeated. Their king is dead, but this is a rare victory for the Anglo-Saxons. For decades, the great heathen army has torn through the kingdoms of England. Northumbria has fallen, East Anglia has fallen, Mercia has fallen, only Wessex, under King Alfred, still stands, and the Vikings have perfected a strategy that goes beyond simple raiding. It is a strategy of psychological warfare, of breaking the will to resist, and at its heart is the capture and ritual humiliation of high-status women. Think of it from their perspective. A kingdom is not just land and soldiers, it's a symbol, it's a lineage. The queen is the living embodiment of that lineage, the mother of future kings, a figure often tied to the sacred and the divine. To capture her is to capture the kingdom's honor. To control her body is to control the kingdom's future. It is the ultimate act of domination. This wasn't a byproduct of war, it was a central objective. The sagas are filled with these stories, often framed as romantic conquests, but the reality was far darker. We see it in the story of Osa, a queen of Agder in what is now Norway. The saga of the Ynglings tells us that Gudrid the Hunter, a king from Vestfold, proposed marriage to her father. When her father refused, Gudrid didn't just challenge him to a battle, he launched a surprise attack, killed the king and his counselors, and took Osa by force. The saga presents it as a marriage, but it began with the slaughter of her family and her abduction. She was now his property, her kingdom absorbed into his. She later arranged his assassination, a testament to the bitter hatred that must have festered. But for years, she was a hostage queen, her life a constant reminder of her people's defeat. This pattern repeats itself across the Viking world. It wasn't just about securing a throne, it was about demonstrating power in the most visceral way possible. In 841, a Viking fleet sailed up the River Liffey and established a long fort, a fortified naval base, at a place called Dublin, Dublin. From here, they began to systematically terrorize the Irish kingdoms. The Irish annals, terse and grim, record the raids, but they also record the taking of hostages. These were not just any hostages. The Annals of Ulster mention the capture of the great ladies of the North on multiple occasions. These women were political pawns. Their capture ensured the submission of their husbands and fathers. A local king might be tempted to rebel, but not if his daughter or his wife was held in the Viking camp at Dublin. The threat of what would be done to them was a powerful deterrent. The abuse was not random. It was calculated. The Viking social structure was intensely hierarchical. At the top were the jarls and kings. At the bottom were the thralls, the slaves. A captured queen, stripped of her finery and forced into servitude, was a living symbol of her kingdom's fall. She who once gave orders was now forced to take them. She who was once the epitome of honor was now subject to the ultimate dishonor. The sagas sometimes gloss over this with poetic language, but the meaning is clear. In the Laxdæla saga, the Irish princess Melkorka is captured in a raid and sold as a slave to an Icelandic chieftain named Hoskuld. She is so traumatized that she pretends to be mute for years to hide her noble birth. Hoskuld buys her because of her beauty, paying 3 marks of silver for her, a huge sum. He makes her his concubine. She bears him a son, but she is his property. He does not even know her name for a long time. Her royal status means nothing until it is politically convenient to reveal it. For years, she is just a silent, beautiful slave, her past erased. Her future dictated by the man who bought her. Let's dissect the moment of capture. A hall is attacked at night. The defenders are cut down. The long tables, moments before laden with food and drink for a victory feast, are overturned. The women of the household huddle together, their jewelry marking them as high-value targets. The Viking leader would personally claim the highest-ranking woman, the queen or the lady of the hall. This was his right as a conqueror. The Gesta Danorum, a history of the Danes written by Saxo Grammaticus, is filled with such accounts. Though written with a Christian bias, it draws on older pagan tales. It describes conquerors who assailed the chastity of the queens as a way to stain the royal bed. The language is sanitized, but the act is one of profound political and personal violation. It's a message to the defeated men. I have taken your leader's place in his hall and with his wife. I have broken your line. The journey from a captured hall to a Viking long fort was a descent into hell. These women, accustomed to respect and comfort, were now roped together, marched alongside livestock, and subjected to the casual brutality of their captors. The psychological toll is hard to fathom. We get a glimpse of it in the archaeological record. In a mass grave discovered at Repton, a winter camp of the great heathen army, the remains of at least 264 individuals were found. Among them were women. One woman, buried in the corner of what was once a mausoleum for an Anglo-Saxon king, was found with a Viking warrior. She had been killed, a sword wound visible on her pelvis. Was she a camp follower? Or was she a captive, an English noblewoman who met her end far from home? The bones do not tell us her story, but they place her in the heart of the Viking war machine, a silent witness to its brutality. Now consider the children. A queen often had children, heirs to the throne. The fate of these children was grim. Male heirs were almost always killed. They were a future threat, a rallying point for rebellion. The sagas are unambiguous about this. In the Heimskringla, Olaf Tryggvason's rise to power is marked by a trail of slaughtered rivals and their sons. Female children, however, were sometimes spared. Like their mothers, they were valuable commodities. They could be married off to Viking warriors to create alliances or legitimize a claim to land, or they could be sold. The slave trade was a cornerstone of the Viking economy. The markets of the East, in the great cities of the Byzantine and Abbasid empires, craved slaves, and light-skinned girls from the north, especially those with noble features, fetched a high price. Imagine a young princess, her father killed, her mother enslaved, sold to a trader, and shipped thousands of miles away to a land she had never heard of, to a life of servitude in a caliph's harem. This was a very real possibility. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who met Vikings on the Volga River in the 10th century, described them as traders and slave girls. He saw the casual cruelty with which they treated these women. His account is a stark corrective to the romanticized image of the Viking Age. The process of turning a queen into a slave was a form of ritualized degradation. Her fine clothes would be torn from her jewelry taken. She would be given a simple woolen tunic, the garment of a thrall. Her hair, a symbol of her status, might be cut short. She would be forced to perform menial tasks, grinding grain, serving drinks, cleaning the filth of the longhouse. Every moment of her day would be a reminder of her new status, and then there was the ever-present threat of sexual violence. Viking society was polygamous, and powerful men collected wives and concubines as a display of their wealth and status. A captured queen was a prize, her bed a symbol of the conqueror's victory. Any children she bore by her captor belonged to him. They were his lineage, not hers. Her own bloodline had been effectively erased. The story of the women of the Isle of Eigg in the Hebrides provides a chilling example of what could happen. While not queens, they were the inhabitants of a small island community. The annals of Ulster record that in the year 617, the entire population of the island was slaughtered by a rival group. But archaeology tells a more complex story. A cave on the island, known as the Cave of Francis, was excavated in the 19th century. Inside, the remains of nearly 200 individuals were found, mostly women and children. The story, as pieced together, is that they had hidden in the cave to escape a raid, but their hiding place was discovered. The raiders lit a fire at the mouth of the cave, suffocating everyone inside. This was not a battle. This was an extermination. And it shows the utter ruthlessness with which Viking Age conflicts were conducted. For a captured queen, the threat of such a fate would have been a constant reality. Her life, and the lives of her children, were entirely in the hands of her captors. Any defiance could be met with swift and terrible retribution. Let's return to the political dimension. A captive queen could be used to legitimize a conqueror's rule by forcing her into a marriage. The Viking leader could claim a connection to the old royal line. This was a common tactic in an age where politics was deeply personal and dynastic. We see this in the founding of Normandy. The Viking leader Rollo was granted the land that would become Normandy by the Frankish king Charles the Simple in the year 911. Part of the deal was that Rollo would marry the king's daughter, Gisela. This marriage, from the Frankish perspective, was a way to civilize the pagan Viking and integrate him into the Christian world. From Rollo's perspective, it was a way to secure his hold on the land. He was no longer just a warlord, he was the son-in-law of the king. His children would have a legitimate claim to rule. For Gisela, her feelings were irrelevant. She was a piece in a political game, her marriage a treaty written on her body. The psychological impact of this on the defeated kingdom was devastating. Their queen, a figure of respect and even reverence, was now the concubine of their enemy. Their future king would be the son of a foreign invader. It was a message of utter hopelessness. The sagas, for all their focus on male honor, occasionally give us a glimpse of this female perspective. In the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, Egil's wife, Asgerd, is a powerful figure. But her mother was the daughter of a king captured in a raid. The shame of this ancestry is a subtle undercurrent in the story. It shows that even generations later, the stigma of capture and forced marriage remained. The church's reaction to this was complex. On the one hand, clerics condemned the brutality of the Vikings and the forced conversions and marriages. The chronicles are full of lurid tales of pagan atrocities. On the other hand, the church also saw marriage as a way to pacify the Vikings. The marriage of Rollo and Gisela was celebrated as a victory for Christendom. The conversion of the pagan was the ultimate goal, and if that required the sacrifice of a princess, it was a price the church was often willing to pay. The women themselves were caught in the middle. Their bodies a battleground for political and religious ideologies. We must also consider the legal status of these women. In Viking law, a woman's status was tied to her male relatives. Her father, her husband, her son. A captured queen had lost all of these. Her father was dead. Her husband defeated. Her sons were either dead or dispossessed. She was, in a legal sense, a non-person. She had no one to protect her rights, no one to avenge any wrongs done to her. This made her completely vulnerable. The Gragas, the Icelandic law code, has detailed sections on marriage, divorce, doctrine, and property rights, but it has very little to say about the rights of a captive. It was assumed that a captive had no rights. She was property, like a sword or a ship. The economic value of a hostage queen was also a factor. The ransom of a high-status individual could be enormous. In 845 Dur, a Viking fleet led by a chieftain named Ragnar laid siege to Paris. The Frankish king Charles the Bald paid them 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. This was a fortune. The ransom for a queen would have been similarly astronomical, but often, the captors chose not to ransom their prize. A queen was more valuable as a political tool than as a source of cash. Her continued captivity was a constant source of leverage over her former kingdom. Any attempt to rescue her would be met with a threat to her life. She was a human shield, her existence a guarantee of her people's submission. If you value this kind of deep dive into the historical record, a reminder to subscribe to the channel. It lets us continue to make content that goes beyond the surface-level myths. Now, back to the brutal realities of the 9th century. The physical evidence for the fate of these women is often hard to find. Skeletons can tell us about diet, disease, and violent death, but they cannot tell us about the specific circumstances of a person's life. However, sometimes the context of a burial can give us clues. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, discovered in 1904 Damtorgs, is the richest Viking grave ever found. Inside a magnificent burial ship were the remains of 2 women. One was older, in her 60s or 70s, and suffered from severe arthritis. The other was younger, in her early 50s. For a long time, it was assumed that the older woman was Queen Osa, the same queen taken by Gudrud the Hunter, and that the younger woman was a slave sacrificed to accompany her in the afterlife. But recent analysis has questioned this. It's possible that both women were of high status. It's also possible that the older woman was a revered priestess. But the presence of 2 women in such a grand burial raises questions. Was the younger woman a companion, a relative, or a high-status captive, her life story ending in a Norwegian burial mound, her identity lost to time? The grave is a silent testament to the complex and often mysterious roles that women played in Viking society, both as powerful figures and as potential victims. Let's consider the story of Judith of Flanders, the great-granddaughter of Charlemagne. Her life shows the extreme precarity of even the most high-born women. At the age of 12, she was married to Ethelwulf, the King of Wessex, a man more than 30 years her senior. It was a political match, designed to create an alliance against the Vikings. When Ethelwulf died, his son Ethelbald married Judith, his own stepmother. This was considered scandalous, but it was a move to consolidate power. When Ethelbald also died, Judith, still a teenager, was a widow twice over. She sold her properties in England and returned to Francia. But her story was not over. She fell in love with a man named Baldwin, a local count. Her father, the King Charles the Bald, was furious. He had other plans for her. He had her confined to a convent, but Judith and Baldwin eloped. They were excommunicated by the Pope. For 2 years, they were fugitives, hunted by the king's men. Eventually, the Pope intervened and persuaded the king to relent. Judith and Baldwin were allowed to marry. Their story has a happy ending, but it shows the immense pressures and dangers that a royal woman faced. Her life was not her own. She was a pawn in the games of men. And if this was the life of a Frankish princess in her own kingdom, imagine the fate of an Anglo-Saxon or Irish queen in a Viking camp. The sagas offer us one more chilling tale, that of Queen Gunhild. She was the wife of Eric Bloodaxe, a king of Norway and later of Northumbria. The sagas portray her as a powerful and ruthless and manipulative figure, a sorceress who could control the winds. But she was also a political player in her own right. After her husband's death, she fought to secure the throne for her sons. She was a survivor, but the sagas also tell us that she met a grim end. Her enemies, the Jarls of Norway, tricked her into returning from exile. They promised her a marriage alliance, but when she arrived, she was seized and executed by being drowned in a bog. The story may be a later invention, a piece of political propaganda designed to blacken her name, but the method of her alleged death is significant. Bog bodies, preserved for centuries in the peat, are a feature of the northern European landscape. Many of them show signs of a violent death. They were ritually killed and placed in the bog, perhaps as sacrifices to the gods. Whether or not the story of Gunhild is true, it reflects a deep-seated cultural memory of ritual violence, a world where even a queen could end her life as a sacrifice in a dark, silent pool. This was the ultimate profanity. To take a figure of the highest status and offer her up like an animal, her death a spectacle of power and terror. Of course, not all interactions were violent. There were instances of peaceful trade, of cultural exchange, of Vikings settling down and marrying into the local population. The genetic evidence from Iceland, the British Isles, and Normandy shows that many of the first female settlers were not from Scandinavia. They were from Ireland, Scotland, and England. Some of them may have been wives in legitimate marriages, but many of them were likely slaves, captives taken in raids who became the mothers of the next generation. The founding of a new society was built on a bedrock of female bondage. The story of Aud the Deep-Minded, a powerful matriarch who led her followers from Scotland to Iceland, is often cited as an example of a strong Viking woman. But Aud was the exception, not the rule. For every Aud, there were 1,000 unnamed women whose lives were defined by capture, servitude, and the loss of everything they had ever known. Their stories are not recorded in the sagas. They are written in the DNA of their descendants, in the scattered remains in a mass grave, in the silent artifacts of a culture that built its wealth on the backs of the conquered. The victory feast was just the beginning. The real conquest took place in the days, weeks, and years that followed, in the systematic and profane destruction of a woman's identity, her lineage, and her will. This was the true dark art of Viking warfare. The machine that processed these human lives was brutally efficient, a continent-spanning network of rivers and sea lanes greased by human suffering. Its scale is difficult to comprehend, extending far beyond the shores of Britain and Ireland, reaching deep into the heartlands of Europe and Asia. From the muddy, violent Longford in Dublin, a captured Irish princess could be shipped to the markets at Hedeby in southern Denmark, a bustling, chaotic nexus of commerce where Frisian cloth, Rhineland pottery, Norwegian whetstones, and human beings were bartered and sold. Here, amidst the clamor of a dozen languages, she would be sold again, her price negotiated not in local currency, but in the universal silver of the time, the dirhams of the Abbasid Caliphate, which flowed into Scandinavia by the literal ton. Archaeologists have unearthed more than 85,000 of these coins in Sweden alone. With the island of Gotland acting as a central clearinghouse, these hoards are the tangible, shimmering proof of this far-reaching trade network. Each coin, stamped with elegant Kufic script praising a distant caliph, is a silent witness to a transaction that likely involved the sale of a human life. A life that began in a stone fortress in Connaught could be converted into a pocketful of silver in a Danish port. From Hedeby, the journey continued east, a second descent into another, even larger world of enslavement. The Rus, the Vikings of the East, were the undisputed masters of the river routes that formed the arteries of this trade. They established fortified trading posts, called gorods, at key points like Staraya Ladoga and Novgorod, commanding the pathways deep into what is now Russia and Ukraine. Their longships, shallower and lighter than the ocean-going vessels, were dragged overland for miles between river systems and grueling portages. This work, hauling tons of wood and cargo across muddy, forested land, was done by slaves. For captured noblewomen, this part of the journey was a new kind of hell, chained to others, forced to pull alongside beasts of burden, the memory of her former life fading with every agonizing step. The Rus transported furs, wax, honeyus, and amber, but their most precious cargo was human. They moved their goods, both living and inanimate, down two main corridors. One route went down the Dnieper River, past the treacherous rapids where the Pecheneg nomads lay in wait, across the Black Sea to the ultimate metropolis, Constantinople, which the Norse called Miklagard, the Great City. The other, more arduous route, snaked down the Volga, through the territory of the Bulgars, to the Caspian Sea and the glittering markets of the Islamic world. Primarily Baghdad, the city of the caliphs, imagine the final destination for a captured Anglo-Saxon noblewoman, a woman who once managed a great estate and commanded the respect of hundreds, after a journey of thousands of miles, lasting perhaps a full year. She finds herself in the slave market of Italy, the cosmopolitan capital of the Khazar Khaganate on the Volga Delta, or perhaps in the great circular city of Baghdad itself. She is stripped, examined, and displayed on a platform. Her fair skin, blonde or red hair, and light eyes, so common in her homeland, are now marks of exotic rarity, increasing her value. She is surrounded by people speaking languages she cannot comprehend: Arabic, Persian, Turkic, Greek, under a sun hotter than any she has ever known. Her identity is gone. She is no longer Elfgifu, daughter of Elderman Wulfstan. She is now simply a Sakaliba, the generic Arabic term for the fair-skinned slaves from the north. Her value lies in her exotic appearance, her price determined by the purity of her features, the health of her teeth, and her perceived fertility. She might end her days in the sprawling, gilded cage of a caliph's harem, a forgotten concubine among hundreds of other women from across the known world. Her children, if she has any, would be raised as Muslims, speaking Arabic, with no knowledge of their mother's language, gods, or ancestors. Her past becomes a forgotten dream, an untellable story. The archaeological evidence for this vast, forced migration is subtle but chillingly clear. Scandinavian DNA markers appear in the modern populations along these ancient trade routes, a genetic echo of this violent displacement. Brooches, beads, and weapons of distinctly Scandinavian design are found in graves in Western Russia, left behind by the Rus traders and warlords. But the trade's most sinister specialization is recorded in the texts of their customers. The Byzantine court had a specific and constant demand for eunuchs, who were considered the most loyal servants and bureaucrats. The 10th century Persian geographer Ibn al-Faqih noted that the Rus were primary suppliers in this grotesque market. Young boys, captured in Slavic villages or taken in raids further west, would be castrated in brutal, unhygienic conditions, with most dying from infection or blood loss. Those who survived were sold in Constantinople for astronomical prices. This was the true profane depth of the Viking enterprise, the industrial scale mutilation of children for profit, a practice that doesn't appear in the heroic sagas but was a cornerstone of their Eastern economic empire. This entire system was underpinned by a profound and chilling objectification, a legal and social framework that systematically stripped the enslaved of their humanity. In the Old Norse language, the word for a female slave was ambat. It was a word devoid of humanity, carrying the same weight as the word for a tool or a domestic animal. Legal texts like the Norwegian Frostathing Law and the Icelandic Gragas make it clear that the killing of a slave was not considered murder. It was destruction of property. An owner who killed his own slave faced no legal penalty. If another man killed someone's slave, the killer's punishment was not for taking a life, but for theft or vandalism. He would have to pay the owner the slave's market value, the weregild of property, not a person. The sexual violation of a female slave was not a crime against her. It was a crime against her owner's property rights. If another man assaulted her, he had to compensate the owner for the damage to his asset, as if a fence had been broken or a cow lamed. Her body was not her own. It was a commodity, its value measured in ounces of silver, and its violation a matter of commercial dispute. This legal status, or lack thereof, meant that a captive queen, no matter her previous standing, had no recourse, no protection, and no rights. She had ceased to be a legal person. She was a thing. The process of creating this thing was known as seasoning, a brutal period of breaking the captive's will. For a high-status woman, this psychological destruction was as important as the physical capture. It began with the stripping of her identity. Her fine clothes were replaced with a coarse woolen tunic. Her jewelry, symbols of her rank and lineage, was taken as loot. Her name was taken from her. She would be given a new, often demeaning name and beaten if she failed to respond to it. She would be forbidden from speaking her native tongue, forced to learn the rudiments of Norse through commands and blows. This linguistic isolation was a powerful tool, cutting her off from her past and making her completely dependent on her captors. Food would be withheld to enforce obedience. She would be forced to perform the most menial and degrading tasks, mucking out animal stalls, serving the very warriors who had murdered her husband, cleaning the filth of the longhouse. This relentless degradation, combined with the constant threat of casual violence and sexual assault, was designed to erase the queen and leave only the slave. Resistance was nearly impossible and almost always fatal. An open act of defiance would be met with a swift and public death as a warning to other captives. But subtle forms of resistance certainly existed. The story of the Irish princess Melkorka, who feigned muteness for years to hide her noble identity, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Perhaps other women feigned madness or incompetence, or found ways to subtly sabotage the workings of the household. But these small victories would have been won at a terrible cost, likely inviting even greater brutality. The most common form of resistance was the one that left no trace in the historical record, the internal retreat. The creation of an inner world where memory and identity could be preserved, even as the outer world was a landscape of unrelenting horror. Even a compliant high-status captive could be a danger. A queen or noblewoman possessed knowledge. She knew the political landscape of her former kingdom, the rivalries between noble houses, the defensive weaknesses of a particular fortress. Her captors would seek to extract this information, using threats against her or her children to turn her into an unwilling intelligence asset. She could be forced to betray her own people, adding another layer of psychological trauma to her ordeal. Her value was not just in her body or her labor, but in the secrets locked in her mind. The end for a hostage queen or a high-status captive was rarely a peaceful one, even if she survived the initial capture, the seasoning, and the horrors of the slave markets. Her life was one of constant precarity. If she was forced into a marriage or became a long-term concubine, she lived among the people who had slaughtered her family. She was a permanent outsider, always viewed with suspicion, a living reminder of a past war. If her new Viking husband or master died, her position became even more perilous. His heirs might see her, and any children she had by him, as rivals to their inheritance. She could be cast aside in favor of a new wife, sold off, or quietly murdered to simplify the line of succession. There was no retirement, no quiet old age for a woman in her position. She was a political symbol to the very end, and when that symbol was no longer useful or became inconvenient, it was discarded. The sagas are full of these stories, of dowager queens being exiled, imprisoned, or accused of witchcraft and executed. Their lives, which began in the fire-lit warmth of a royal hall, often ended in a ditch, a desolate cell, or the cold waters of a fjord. Their names remembered only as a footnote in the bloody history of a dynasty they were forced to serve. This was the world the Vikings made, a world of relentless, predatory violence where the sacred bonds of kinship, loyalty, and royalty were systematically broken and remade to serve the conqueror. For every powerful woman like Aud, the deep-minded, or Olga of Kiev, whose name we know, there were thousands more whose names are lost to history, their fates unrecorded, their suffering forgotten. They were the silent price of the Viking Age, the human currency that financed the longships, built the trading towns, and was exchanged for the mountains of Arabic silver. Their profane treatment was not an aberration of war, it was the very instrument of conquest, a calculated strategy of psychological terror and cultural erasure. But this cycle of brutality, this assumption of absolute power over the conquered, was not a one-way street. The conquered learned from the conquerors. The Anglo-Saxons, after nearly 2 centuries of terror, began to adapt. Under Alfred the Great and his successors, they built a network of fortified towns, the burhs, and reorganized their armies. They learned to fight the Vikings on their own terms, and as their confidence grew, they began to repay the violence they had suffered. Sometimes with an organized and terrifying precision. The policy of profanity had been adopted by its victims. This reached its apex in the year 1002. On the 13th of November, the feast day of St. Brice, the English king, Ethelred the Unready, issued a secret order. He decreed that all Danes living in England were to be killed, accusing them of plotting to assassinate him and seize his kingdom. What followed was a state-sanctioned ethnic cleansing. Chronicles record that Danish settlers, men, women, and children, were dragged from their homes and slaughtered. The archaeological proof of this new, colder English brutality is stark. In 2009, archaeologists excavating a site for a new road near Weymouth in Dorset, on the south coast of England, made a staggering discovery. They found a mass grave, a burial pit dating to this exact period of escalating conflict between the years 970 and 1025. It contained the skeletons of 54 young men, all of them in their late teens or early 20s. All of them had been decapitated. The execution had been a gruesome, public spectacle. The bodies had been thrown into the pit, but the heads were piled separately to one side. The forensic analysis, published in reports by Oxford Archaeology, painted a grim picture. These were not men killed in the heat of battle. They were prisoners. Many had defensive wounds on their hands and arms, suggesting they had tried to fend off the blows. The execution itself was clumsy and brutal. Marks on the neck vertebrae showed that it often took multiple hacks with a sword to sever a head. These men were made to watch as their comrades were butchered one by one. And the final, crucial detail came from the isotopic analysis of their teeth, which revealed their origins. They were not locals, nor were they from anywhere in Britain. They had grown up in Scandinavia, with one individual coming from as far north as the Arctic Circle. This was a captured Viking war party, systematically and ritually executed by the local Anglo-Saxons. They were not given a warrior's burial. They were disposed of like animals, their deaths a spectacle of retribution, a cold message of reversed power. The violence they had perfected, the ritual humiliation they had inflicted on so many others, had finally been turned back on them with horrifying symmetry. The hostage queen in the longhouse and the headless Viking in the pit were two sides of the same bloody coin, different outcomes of the same unforgiving reality. Power was the only law, and it was a law written in fear.